It's February already, February 3rd, 2023. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us today at Secular AZ. We are a nonprofit organization focused on protecting the Constitution and the separation of church and state for over a decade. We have incredible programming, including our Friday updates from all kinds of amazing speakers, including historians, authors, elected officials, journalists, etc. I'm really excited because next Friday, we're kicking off our series about Arizona's criminal justice system with Amelia Kramer with the ACLU, and she's going to be speaking about the Safer Communities, Secure Families, and Pretrial Justice for All Act. And we will be having conversations about prison labor, private prisons, what it's like for an inmate in Arizona's prisons, and the two-tiered criminal justice system in the coming weeks. So if you do like this kind of programming, please support our work at secularaz.org and consider becoming a recurring donor to support the work that we do, not only here, but at the legislature. We are now working on a school board support network initiative, action alerts. Get signed up for those because you'll hear the latest of all the crazy banana stuff that's going on at the state legislature. We're a good group to belong to, and I hope you'll consider joining us. So for today, though, I'm really excited to welcome Teddy Wilson. He is a journalist and a researcher with a decade of experience covering the U.S. Christian right. He is the publisher of the Radical Reports, a newsletter that provides research, analysis, and intelligence on the radical right. Previously, he was the U.S. investigations editor at Open Democracy, research analyst at Political Research Associates, and staff reporter at Rewire News Group. So Teddy, welcome. Did I miss anything in your bio that you would like to cover?
No, I think you got the basics of it. I think I'm gonna kind of give myself a more expansive introduction so that folks know where I'm coming to this from. But no, thank you for the introduction. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to get to talk with everybody today about all this.
Well, and thank you for joining our small but scrappy group here. We really are, one of the only secular organizations that focuses on what's happening at the legislature and, attempts to lobby the legislature, but it is Arizona, so it's not always easy to do. So thank you for joining us. And I'm just going to hand it off to you.
Right. Well, I would say that Arizona, I think, is one of the more important places right now for those of us that research and report on the U.S. radical right and various far right movements in the United States. I think it's really become the center of many of those different movements in a lot of unfortunate ways. But it's great that there are so many folks like y'all in Arizona to push back against really right-wing authoritarianism, right? So it's a real pleasure to get to chat with you about this today. So I'll give myself a little bit of a brief introduction so folks kind of understand kind of my background a little bit more and where I'm coming at this from. So like was said in the introduction, I'm a journalist and I'm a researcher. I began actually my career in community radio. That's where all of this started, believe it or not, at a little community radio station called KUS Community Radio in Bryan College Station, where I live, and started with programming things like Democracy Now!, making sure that got broadcasted out, and hosted a news and information show where we talked about various topics, just like some of the topics we're going to discuss today. And then I spent a few years doing freelance reporting, mostly around Texas. As was mentioned, I was a staff reporter for Rewire News Group, where I focused mostly on the anti-abortion movement and reporting on anti-abortion legislation in state legislatures. And so that's actually where I really began reporting on the Christian right and understanding that movement pretty deeply. So after that, I worked at a couple other places, Political Research Associates, Open Democracy, where I focused on those issues even more. And over the years, my focus tended to focus more specifically on the far right and various parts of those movements. And also, I think another important piece of this is I know y'all are a secular organization, but I think it's important context to this that I'm actually a practicing Episcopalian. You know, I grew up in a couple different churches. My father's actually Catholic. My mother was a minister. She's retired now. And I think I spent about a decade out of the church before I came back in and settled on Episcopalian. And I say that because I think it's important to, when you are understanding various parts of the Christian right and Christian nationalism, there is a tendency for Christians that are part of the broader kind of what, to use the parlance, body of Christ, to dismiss that part of Christianity as not Christian, right? There's a tendency to say that they are hijacking Christianity. And I think it's important not to do that. I think that is dismissive, and it is an attempt to absolve people that are Christians or followers of Christ, or however they want to describe themselves, of the harm that has been done by Christianity or in the name of the church. So I think that's important to acknowledge, that not only am I coming at this from someone that has a deep history in reporting on and understanding the Christian right and the various elements of the far right, I'm also coming at of someone who has kind of grew up in a lot of that culture, understands it deeply, and is also still part of that culture in some ways. I think whenever I talk about this, I always end up quoting my friend Bradley Onishi, who just wrote an excellent book that is just out called Preparing for War. It's all about the Christian right and Christian nationalism. And one of the things he says often is religions are as religious people do. You can't separate a religion from the practitioners of it. And another person I'll quote is Chrissy Stroop, who's a great writer who has written actually about this very subject, about abuse within the Christian church, who often talks about this, about how when you say that there are that there are Christians that are hijacking Christianity, or they're not actual real Christians, then you are by default saying that all the rest of the Christians are good, right? You're defaulting that Christianity is by its nature good. And we know by the history of the Christian church, particularly in America, where it is deeply seated in white supremacy, that isn't true. So I just thought that was important context to bring to this discussion. So I was originally invited on to talk about a tweet or a thread of tweets that I posted a while back, which is how I end up having these discussions a lot lately, is through something I posted on Twitter, it seems like. So I'll just read the first top line tweet, and that is: the far right in Texas is obsessed with quote unquote groomers and child predators. Are they looking in the right place? This year in Texas, several pastors or staffers of Christian churches have been arrested, charged, or convicted for various allegations of sexual abuse of children. And so following that, I posted numerous examples of both pastors, staffers of churches, associate pastors that have just during the past year were arrested and charged for sexual abuse of children. And the allegations ranged from, abusing a 7-year-old girl for years and years and years to abusing multiple boys over years and years and years. And so there were many differences in the specifics, but some of the things that remained constant were that it was often ignored or overlooked, or in some cases even outright covered up by the church. And also that oftentimes when people try to bring it to the attention of the church, either to elders or other authority figures within the church, a lot of times those offerings of reaching out for help were ignored or dismissed. And this is something that has played out quite a bit throughout the Christian church. And I think I'm going to talk about this in a couple different contexts, particularly within the context of the kind of current moment that we're seeing with the targeting of the LGBTIQ community. But I also think it's important to delve a little bit deeper into the context of sexual abuse within the Christian church. So I think a lot of people are at this time are really familiar with the amount of allegations that have come out about sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. If anybody has ever seen the movie Spotlight, I think you have a kind of understanding of how pervasive that was and continues to be, and how the institutional structures of the church aided in the covering up of that abuse, and how the victims, the survivors of that abuse, were treated and dismissed. And so I think that's something everybody is familiar with, but I think most people aren't as familiar with all the other examples in different denominations or sect within the Christian church, particularly in America, where this happens. There are some kind of really notable examples that I would highlight, starting with some amazing investigative reporting from one of the members of that team that was on Spotlight on with the Boston Globe, and that was Michael Resendez, who, while he's working for the Associated Press, did a deep investigation into the sexual abuse within the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, and how that was covered up, and how institutional structures were built to prevent survivors and victims of sexual assault to receive justice, any kind of justice, how the perpetrators were protected, and how the victims were blamed a lot of times for the abuse. There was also some really excellent reporting from what was then, I think, the Center for Investigative Reporting, what is now Reveal, into the same type of behavior, same type of sexual abuse and cover up within the Jehovah's Witness Church. And then also, more recently, I think it's important to mention the reporting of the Houston Chronicle and the reporters there. Some of you, or probably most of you, are probably pretty familiar at this point with the sexual abuse allegations that have come out surrounding the Southern Baptist Convention and the thousands of churches that are members of that denomination and organization, where the Southern Baptist Convention was basically had a spreadsheet database of all these various allegations against pastors and church members and staffers at members of the Southern Baptist Convention around the country. I think the reporting done by those reporters for the Houston Chronicle, multiple reporters, really led to somewhat of a reckoning at the Southern Baptist Convention, and eventually led to, I think it was a 300, 400 page report that was published by the convention, with some redactions, but they eventually did publish, I think, a list of more than 200 named individuals who were credibly accused of various types of sexual abuse. I think also one issue to note is that, this is something that happens in essentially every denomination within the Christian church. And I think one of the most biggest challenges for folks that care about this issue is the growth in independent non-denominational churches and how that has impeded justice and allowed the perpetrators of these abuses to escape that justice. And so for those that might not be familiar, until about 50 years ago or so, the Christian denominations, the Catholic and then the various Protestant denominations were really the key structures of the American church. But over the last 50 years, those denominations have slowly lost power and lost influence over the broader Christian church for lots of reasons, including what people have called the increase in the nuns, the none of the aboves, or the people that no longer identify as religious, people leaving the church, but also the dramatic increase in churches that are not affiliated with a denomination, and these can take on several different forms. I think one of the more kind of prominent forms that a lot of folks might be familiar with is these large mega churches, right? There are some mega churches that are affiliated with various denominations. There's some really large mega churches of 10 or 12,000 that are affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention, for example. But there's plenty of other mega churches ranging in size from 3,000 to 4,000 to 8,000 to 10,000 that may not necessarily be affiliated with a particular denomination. There's also an easy way to kind of spot these churches in your community. Is often they have names that include something like Bible, right? The Grace Bible Church, or the Christ Redeemer Bible Church, or something like that. Those can be much smaller, but they are independent, and so they don't have the same kind of structures as the denominations. So what that means is, when there is any kind of not just abuse, but any kind of problems within that church, everything is handled internally within that church. There are no higher authority figures for congregants or parishioners to appeal to, right? You have a single authority figure, and that's the minister of the church. And so, over the years, I have heard, I don't even know how many, dozens of stories from folks from various denominations and various independent churches about their experiences and the abuse that they have suffered at the hands of not just ministers or priests, but also elders within the church, prominent church members, and also another form of abuse that I think really hasn't been deeply covered enough is when church members are abused by their partners, whether it's a spouse or other relative. That abuse, when the survivor comes forward and tries to seek help from their church, that abuse is often covered up, and those victims are often blamed for the abuse themselves. So that is all to say that this is a really expansive problem. It's really complicated in many different ways depending on where it's happening. There is not, I think, necessarily a singular cause for all of this. Although I would point to a couple different causes, particularly when we're talking about this within the context of the white evangelical churches, the fundamentalist churches. And that is in part a theological problem. Many of these churches are structured in a way in which theology is taught in a very authoritarian way, meaning whatever you're hearing from the minister or the church leader as their interpretation of scripture or what it means or their particular dogma and belief system, the members of the church are not ever encouraged to really discuss that or question that particular interpretation. They're being told what something is. This is what this verse means. And so I think that kind of authoritarian structure really is one of the elements that leads to this, not necessarily the sexual abuse itself, but the covering up of sexual abuse and the minimizing of it when it happens. So that's some of the background here about sexual abuse within the Christian church broadly. But I did want to talk more also about the context of this happening within the broader attacks from the far right and right-wing media on the LGBTIQ community, because I think that's kind of the main part of how I was framing that question about, are people looking in the right place? So I wanted to start off with a definition before I get into that, which might seem like a trope, but I think for me, it's important to discuss definitions up front because of my area of research. There's a lot of terminology that I use that I think it's important to make clear what it means and what it is. When I'm talking about far right neo-fascist movements, I think it's important to identify that there is a difference between white supremacist and white nationalist and what that means. But for this, I think one of the words that has been appropriated by the far right has been this term groomer, right? I'm sure many of you have seen this term being used. And I think it's fascinating as someone that watches or analyzes a lot of language and rhetoric that the far right uses. I think it's really important to understand far right narratives, right? To understand how they have been using this word, right? Because this word actually has a positive connotation that I think is interesting, that's kind of been lost now, right? To groom someone, you can groom someone in a positive way, whether you're grooming them, training them in a profession, right? I would say over the years, I've had many editors that have groomed me to become a better journalist and researcher. When I was in the military, I've heard the phrase grooming someone for command. But grooming does have a specific negative connotation and specific in law, in legality, and it's not what the far right is using it. So this is a broad definition. It can vary by state, but grooming means to emotionally over time through friendship, gifts, flattery, etc., in order to entrap a person into a sexually abusive or predatory relationship. And so that can take place in a lot of different ways, but that's kind of the definition of what that actually means. And the far right has taken that term and twisted it and manipulated it to mean essentially any display of queerness in public, right? Any display of public displaying who they are among the LGBTIQ community. In fact, in many ways, anyone from the LGBTIQ community, particularly trans folks, existing is considered grooming now by the far right. So to get into that a little bit further, so there's been a specific targeting of this community by the far right and the GOP over the years, over the last few years. And so this has taken place in legislation too. So this is anything from restricting access to public restrooms, to banning transgender youth from participating in youth sports, to bans on gender affirming care. And now they are targeting drag shows as well.
Hey, Teddy, so real quick, just yesterday in, oh boy, the House, I think Judiciary Committee, I can't remember exactly which one, but there was a bill here. I believe it's 1028. There's a couple more coming down. And I think, God, Jesus, and biblical scripture were referenced probably a dozen times in that committee, even by people who are elected. And all I could think was, I've seen real indoctrination, and that happens at the churches, but this bill would essentially outlaw a drag performance that could potentially be viewed by a child. So if there's a window, and many of our gay bars in Phoenix have windows, it would mean that plays like Hairspray, or, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of the other one that was brought up the other day. But, if anybody's dressed in drag and ASU wants to put on a performance, or of Marat Sade, where there's a scene of nudity, they would no longer be allowed because they receive state funds. So we're seeing a barrage of these anti-drag, anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ bills. And so I just kind of wanted to insert that in there, because, at least in Arizona, we have a governor who has already expressed that she will veto any such discriminatory laws. But in places like, I don't know, Oklahoma, Missouri, wherever, where they have majority in the ledge and, Republican governors, these are going to sail through. So that was more of a comment and commentary on things. And I guess also maybe a question for now or later about like, what can we do and say in these committee hearings as, to testify, to appeal to these people, when many of us have maybe come from being indoctrinated in various churches, et cetera. So I don't know if that's something that you can answer now. And I'm sorry, I just wanted to insert that because it's so timely right now in Arizona.
No, thank you for that. I think that goes to, there's a couple points in there that I could start with. One, I think one of the reasons I think that the far right targets trans folks and drag shows in particular goes directly to some of the topics that we were talking about within the Christian church. And it is fed by various elements of purity culture, a term that some of you might be familiar with, right? And it is essentially this idea that any performance of femininity is inherently sexual, right? Within this theology of fundamentalist Christianity, where a lot of this abuse takes place, men are viewed as inherently sexual beings that can't control ourselves, and women are viewed as not supposed to be exhibiting that sexuality, right? Their sexuality is supposed to be hidden from men, otherwise we would be tempted. And so that kind of view of the genders and gender role, I think really kind of is at the bottom of this, right? In why any performance of femininity, if a man performs being a woman, whether however that takes place, whether he is just a drag performer, a gay man, or whether or not they're a transgender woman, right? All of that is viewed as inherently sexual among the far right. That's why you will see things, if you look at some of the comments on Twitter and social media, that a drag show is always inherently sexual, because they view women as inherently sexual. And I think connected to that, and this is something that I've been talking about a lot, is that that weaponization of misogyny and the use of the patriarchy as an institutionalized weapon is really at the core of far-right authoritarian movements, right? I think it's important to acknowledge how important misogyny is to those movements. And then as far as your other question, kind of your comment, if you could, now I'm blanking on what it was. Could you refresh me what you were getting to there?
Well, I guess, how do we try to appeal to people when
Right.
they see, anybody who wants to express their, sexuality, gender, and it's not even about that. We're talking about art and performance and people's artistic expression and their ability to make money. Like, how do we get through to these folks? And I fear that the answer is, well, we just don't.
Well, I think the most effective thing to pushing back against these kinds of movements is essentially having the people that are impacted by these movements, having their voices heard and amplified. And I think a really good example of where this has been really effective is in the push to ban so-called conversion therapy. So for those that might not be familiar, so-called conversion therapy is this idea that members of the LGBTQ community, a gay man, a lesbian woman, bisexual, genderqueer, that through prayer and various types of religious teaching, that they can overcome their sexual identity and become heterosexual. Essentially, is the idea that through these so-called therapies, they can change their gender identity or sexual orientation. There is mountains of evidence that has shown how harmful so-called conversion therapy is, and how many negative outcomes have come out of it. And so I think that has a good blueprint, the push to ban conversion therapy, particularly on the local level. I can't remember exactly the numbers, but I know it's been, I think, over 100 cities and municipalities in the United States alone have passed ordinances to ban conversion therapy. And at the center of that lobbying effort were people from those communities, people that either had survived conversion therapy or people that were just genderqueer, members of the LGBTIQ community, who went to county commissioner meetings, who went to city council meetings, who gave a face to the people making the policy decisions. So I think that's a model that I think has a proven track record. The only problem with that model is that it does put a lot of the labor on the folks that are from those marginalized communities, right? And so I think there's always a place for folks that are not from marginalized communities that I don't use the word ally. I use words like operate in solidarity with, or one of my favorites is now I'm blanking on it, like collaborator, co-conspirator. That's what I wanted to. But so if you're not from those communities, you can show up and testify and amplify their voices and tell their stories as well. So I think giving a face to these things, I think, is important. So,
well, and even yesterday in committee, first of all, our legislature seems to have gotten even more hostile towards public comments at committee hearings, and I couldn't believe how hostile they were. And one of the discussions that I had with one of the coalition groups that I work with was, we don't want to re-traumatize those folks, because literally people left that meeting in tears after being berated and bullied by Republican members of the committee. And real quick, Stacey Travers. So Representative Stacey Travers is here today. She's actually one of our state representatives, I believe LD 16, but she'll be able to tell you. She has her hand up for a question, because I know that this is something that's very important to her. Go ahead, Stacy.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Okay.
you.
Yeah, I guess my question to you, and I was like, should I ask or should I wait, or is so the bill that I'm running is basically Victoria Steele's bill last session, which no longer exempts clergy from the mandatory reporting of any sexual abuse of a minor, and that came from constituents in my district who were LDS, who were very upset about Bisbee. And one of the arguments that I get from proponents is uh, First Amendment, and not freedom of speech, but the free exercise of religion. And I guess in your experience, do you have any feedback as to how to circumnavigate that argument that gets presented?
Yeah, I mean that's a difficult question. I would say first off, I'm not a lawyer.
No, but just somebody who works in the space and who might have an
Right,
idea.
right. And although even though I'm not a lawyer, there are lots of of right-wing lawmakers who are not lawyers themselves who write a lot of this legislation pretty poorly, in my head too. Um, no, I think there there is always that balance that has to be struck, right? When you're talking about the First Amendment between the free exercise of religion, um, but also the protection of people from criminal harm. I think there's been, and this is part of a broader movement on the right, to use the First Amendment or a reinterpretation of the religious freedom part of that clause, right, to shield uh, fundamentalist Christians from any kind of criminal liability, or to allow them to essentially discriminate, right? And this goes back more than a decade. If you're interested in kind of getting into the weeds of this, a former colleague of mine, Frederick Clarkson, over the Political Research Associates, have written quite extensively about how the right has redefined what religious liberty is and what it means, and how they've weaponized that in cases just like this. What I'll say is, with regards to kind of the reporting requirement for clergy, is I think there has been changes over the years, depending on the state, to those requirements. I think Utah might have changed it. Don't quote me on that, but I think Utah might have been one of those states that has made modifications and changes to it. And I think the strongest argument against it is that, clergy, depending on the denomination, have always been able to break that confidentiality depending on the circumstances, right? A priest has been able to report someone if he thinks that there's imminent harm, if something's about to happen. So there's always been exceptions to those rules. And I think particularly when it comes to the LDS church, the way that law and the kind of the clergy exception was used to shield abusers is really particularly egregious in that case, particular. So yeah, I think there's probably a lot of good lawyers out there that know the First Amendment much better than me that could really speak to that. But I would say that, yeah, there's always been exceptions to it, and that religious liberty shouldn't be used as a shield to protect people from to protect bigotry and to protect people from abuse within the church. So
And interestingly enough, yesterday, while this, trans ban bill or this drag show bill was going passed on party lines, the education committee, there's another state senator that we have who's a lifelong educator, Christine Marsh. She had a bill that would mandate that private schools, which are now being funded with public dollars in the state of Arizona, that private schools would have to mandate that their staff and faculty all get fingerprint clearance cards the same way they have to do in public schools. And he removed that bill from the committee hearing yesterday. So I guess my question then is, and this might even be for Representative Travers too, like, would it help to point out that hypocrisy when they're sitting there in judiciary telling folks that they care so much about kids that they want to shield them from drag shows, but on the very same day, they didn't want to even hear a bill that would mandate fingerprint clearance. Like, would that be helpful, I wonder, in testimony to point out, or even there was another bill yesterday in education about flying the flag in all Arizona classrooms, or the teacher or the school district could face $1,000 fine. But private schools that are funded now by public taxpayer dollars are exempt from that. Would that be helpful in testimony, or would it just fall on deaf ears? And again, this question might actually be for Teddy or for Representative Travers.
For me, I think it would to use previous precedent as was just stated, but I don't know about for Senator Marsh.
Well, and I know that you're brand spanking new to the legislature, and you're just now getting your sea legs. So, again, if that is something that would be helpful, we should do it. But I don't know, what is your perspective on that, Teddy?
Well, I would say I don't know the particulars of the bill, but what I would say is what's interesting about this is that in recent years, there has been a real cottage industry developed within kind of the fundamentalist Christian kind of community, the U.S. Christian right more broadly, of like background checks of people that are involved with children. So there's a couple of examples of this that I think are interesting. So one, there is this group called Trail Life, which is substantially a alternative version of the Boy Scouts, but for fundamentalist Christians. There's also a version of the Girl Scouts called Heritage Girls. And any members, adult members, have to go through this background check. And the same thing with a lot of these Christian churches that have really gotten into youth sports, right? So if you want to be a coach of a youth sport team, whether it's soccer or basketball, you have to go through these background checks. And a lot of times they're done by a few companies that work almost exclusively with these Christian organizations and churches. And so there's a whole industry around background checks, and ensuring that there's all the adults that are around children are protected. So I think it's interesting that they are supportive of that happening within their community, but they would have any pushback against any kind of minimal requirements to ensure children are safe in private or public school. So I think that's an interesting dichotomy there.
So I just am looking to make sure I'm not missing any questions, but it looks like maybe there's a few comments here in the chat. I know that Brandy Reese posted something about, let's see, we've got House Bill 2351 sponsored by Patty Contreras, who's in District 12. I think that's alongside with Stacy. Somebody corrected me in the chat. And that would ban healthcare professionals from using the abusive, widely discredited practice of LGBT conversion therapy on minors. These methods can include electric shocks, induced vomiting, elastic bands snapped against the skin, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's pretty gross. You can read it in the chat yourself. But she is encouraging people to reach out to the House Health Chair, Steve Montenegro, and the House Judiciary Chair, Quang Nguyen, to ask the bill be placed on an agenda, because that's part of our problem here in Arizona. We have some really great bills that really are actually focused on protecting kids and taking care of them, because now also in Arizona, we are stuck with this 15-week abortion ban. And while, you know, they want to mandate forced pregnancies on people by eliminating abortion health care, they don't really want to do much in the way of taking care of that child after they're out of the womb. So we see this every year in Arizona. I think it's like less than 1% of the bills that are introduced by Democrats even get a hearing. So thank you, Brandy, for advocating that advocacy with all of the people on this call. So make sure you call. There's another comment. Yeah, Stacy says that bill gets introduced every year. It used to be Sean Bowie, blah, blah, blah. The one Republican who might have engaged with that bill has lost his primary, because that's what happened in Arizona too. The more moderate you were, like Rusty Bowers, who is the Speaker of the House, who testified at the January 6th committees, well, he lost his primary. And a lot of the more moderate Republicans, who weren't really even moderate in my point of view, lost their primaries. So Jeff is asking in the chat, a lot of those bans have religious exemptions. How do we frame these actions in a way to stop these exemptions? I guess that's just the question this Friday. And I think we kind of already covered that. It's difficult.
Well, I can speak to that a little bit. One thing I want to point out too is the specifics of the bill banning conversion therapy for minors. So that's something that I forgot to mention when I was mentioning all the bans on conversion therapy. They are essentially all focused on banning conversion therapy for minors, so people under the age of 18, right? So it doesn't ban conversion therapy for anyone who's an adult. And that, I think, is also part of the recipe that for that success, right? Because they have made it focused. It's about LGBTIQ youth, right? This is about protecting them from something harmful. It's a much harder argument to make that adults shouldn't be able to make their own choices if they want to engage in that kind of thing, right? It's a much harder kind of push to make. So there's that point. I think it's important. And this is something that I think is important, especially for a secular organization. One of the other ingredients that made those pushes for bans on conversion therapy for minors successful was the engagement and inclusion in part of the coalition of clergy, right? And of faith leaders and of people from kind of other parts of the movement, right? So a lot of these places, some of the most effective speakers that I've seen were, say, ministers or reverends from the Episcopal Church, or reverends from ministers from the United Church of Christ and other more progressive denominations are often some of the most outspoken people at some of these meetings, whether they're city council meetings or county commissioner meetings. So I think, and that there was, depending on the ordinance and the specifics, there were some religious exemptions, but they were kind of narrowly tailored. And I don't want to get into the specifics of what they are, because they're different depending on which ordinance you're looking at, depending on the city and county and stuff. But for the most part, they were pretty narrow, but they were there. So I think when you talk about these issues, I think it's good to think about how can we build the broadest possible coalition, right? And so that means engaging with faith leaders across the spectrum of religions, both Christian and Jewish, right? Any other religious faith, and also building your coalition across lines from everything else, because I think one of the kind of most important lessons that I've taken from covering the anti-abortion movement and engaging with the folks that have pushed back against that, folks from the reproductive justice movement, is that so many of these things are interconnected, right? It's not just about abortion access when you're talking about reproductive justice, right? It's education. Access to education is a reproductive justice issue. Access to affordable healthcare is a reproductive justice issue, right? And so I think when you're thinking about these issues, I think it's important to think about who are other folks that we can ally with, whether it's the faith community or other communities. And in Arizona, I think I know of so many great grassroots organizations that have been on the ground in Arizona and New Mexico next door, whether it's reproductive justice advocates, indigenous activists, like so many great organizations that are on the ground there, that I think building coalitions around those various issues, I think it's never easy, right? But I think there's definitely fertile ground there for y'all to partner with different groups. So that's kind of
and yeah, it's never easy for sure. And as one of the designated lobbyists for Secular AZ, I belong to an LGBTQ coalition, reproductive rights coalition. There's a really great organization here called Arizona Faith Network, with more, I guess, progressive faith leaders from all faiths, not just Christianity, who do this work. And we even have a state representative, Stephanie Stahl Hamilton, who is an ordained Presbyterian minister, who, and I say this all the time, but she scored 100% on our secular scorecard, because as a faith leader, she understands the importance of the government staying out of her church and the importance of the church staying out of government affairs. But again,
right.
It always seems to fall on dead ears. The Bible is treated like a buffet, and you take what you want and you leave behind the rest. And, I get that. Like, if I were to read the Bible and take the things that fit my ideology, it's real easy. But so it's a difficult thing, because they have this more Old Testament kind of perspective on while leading and saying I'm a follower of Christ, but all they ever quote is Old Testament. So it's hard.
Right. Well, and I would also say, I think one thing that I think you folks in Arizona specifically, if you're looking for hope, is that the far right, lots of organizations, lots of right-wing political organizations put lots of money into Arizona this past election cycle. It was like the center of the universe for the right wing. Charlie Cook basically set up shop out there, right? With Turning Point USA and all these various kind of affiliated right-wing groups. And despite all of that money that was poured in there, the kind of the three-headed right-wing monster that you had out there between the governor, the Republican governor candidate for governor, Republican candidate for Senate, and the Republican candidate for Secretary of State. You have an election conspiracist, a white nationalist, and a QAnon here, basically. When you look at how the results happened, there was a lot of Republicans that voted for their whether it's member of Congress or state legislature down the ballot, and just didn't vote for the top. There was thousands of Republicans that were like, nope, not going to vote for those three. And so I think when you're looking for kind of silver linings and places to build bipartisan coalitions, I think it's easy to kind of be stuck in the mindset that yes, there are 20 to 35% of voters that are kind of on that right wing that you are never going to convince, right? Um, there are still 25 to 35% of the Republican Party that I think are still supportive of Trump, that when the Republican primary comes around, they will vote for Trump again. And the Republican Party has a big problem on their hands, because if they can't coalesce around another alternative candidate, Trump is easily going to win the nomination. But that's a different design. But what I'm saying is, there's a lot of people out there that consider themselves Republicans in maybe kind of that old school Chamber of Commerce way, right? That know lots of people that are LGBTQ within their families, right? And so I think if you're kind of looking for that silver lining, there's a lot of people out there that, you know, maybe drag shows, they might think they're weird or whatever, but they don't think that drag queens are grooming kids, right? Maybe there's a lot of people out there that don't understand what it means to be genderqueer, right? Or don't understand why there's so many different pronouns, but they don't actively hate gay people, right? And I think there's an opportunity, I think, to reach some of those folks when it comes to these issues. I think it's easy to kind of get stuck, especially where I spend most of my time in the far right, that there's like a big chunk of this country that is never going to kind of change their views on this or a lot of other things. But there's a lot of people that I think that can change. And I think the easiest example of how that has happened is the public opinions around same-sex marriage that just changed dramatically. I think it was support was like 40 or 35%, in 2010, and now after the Supreme Court ruling in 2015, it's like 70% or something. Like, with a lot of these issues, I think it's easy to kind of feel defeatist about what we're facing, for protecting marginalized people's rights. But I think over time, I think the public tends to be on the progressive side on most of these issues. So
I would agree with you there, and it kind of goes along. So I'm going to close this out real quick, because Sandra asked, and this happens every Friday, like, where is the hope? And like, like you were just saying, I do think that, there is a trend of folks, and I know that the younger generation, especially, Mark says hope is drinking a margarita with faith at a local bar. Okay. That's also, it's Friday. You can do whatever you want after this. Jeff also says, along with your Substack, what other resources are out there that provide a clear understanding of where the religious right is coming from? It's different for me to understand. I think maybe he means it's difficult for me to understand their point of view and how to talk to them when my worldview is so different from theirs.
okay. I was going to give another kind of element of hope too before that, and that is there, with any of these issues, there's always people kind of on the ground doing the good fight, right? When you talk about reproductive justice issues, there's lots of particularly Black women down in the South that are doing amazing work organizing, or here in Texas where I live, doing a lot of Latinx women doing amazing work, kind of in South Texas. And within kind of this sexual abuse within the Christian church, there's a lot of folks doing really good work. If you have followed the hashtag Church2 movement on Twitter, or the ex-evangelical movement, or the deconstruction movement, there's a lot of kind of relatively young compared to me, but folks in their 20s and early 30s that grew up in these churches that are really doing a lot of work to not just expose what has happened, the sexual abuse, but also expose another element of it, which is this is also spiritual abuse. And there's a lot of folks that are doing really great work around this. I mentioned earlier, Chrissy Stroop is one of them. But as far as kind of resources for understanding the Christian right and the far right, well, I would, I guess I have a couple book recommendations then I'll make. I think one excellent book, if you want to kind of understand, particularly the Christian right and the kind of the misogyny and the kind of this performance of masculinity within the Christian right, I highly recommend reading Jesus and John Wayne. I think that's just one of the best books out there to understand that kind of theology. And then I think it hasn't come out yet, but when it does, I've got really lucky and got a review copy. Jeff Charlotte, who wrote the book The Family, and C Street has a new book coming out, all about the Christian right and kind of the kind of apocalyptic narratives that have been animating the far right in recent years. I don't have it in front of me. I can't remember the name, but I've read most of that book and I highly recommend it. And also,
And Lindsay did put that in the chat. It's called The Undertow.
oh, that's right. That's right. And if you want a historical perspective on the Christian right, I think there's another book I would recommend, One Nation Under God, by Kevin Cruz, I think is a really excellent book. So those are books I would recommend reading that kind of could give you kind of a very different perspectives on the Christian right and the far right. And they're all pretty, they're because there's a lot of other books out there that have been written by academics into these subjects that are a little bit harder reading. They're a little denser, but these are written for a general audience, and I think could give you a good perspective.
Excellent.
But yeah, so
Well, let's go then on our original path to like positivity for this Friday afternoon. I watched earlier today. Teddy had a Twitter space where who was the person you were speaking with, because she would also be a fabulous speaker. I can't remember her name now, but she was fantastic. And it was kind of she tracks Tucker Carlson on the regular, which sounds terrible, kind of like Hemet Mehta, who also joined us. I don't know if you know the Friendly Atheist, Hemet Mehta,
right.
But he, he tracks all the Christian hate preachers that have these YouTube channels. I don't know how they have the stomach for it, because I sit in one legislative hearing here in the state of Arizona and I want to punch myself in the face for the rest of the day. So, yeah. So anyway, from that Twitter space that you had today, I loved your closing because you said, we need a little bit of positivity. So, and the question that you asked was, what is the most positive or best thing that you saw on the internet?
Yeah, well, I was, what's your favorite thing on the internet, or what's been giving you joy? And by the way, her name was Kate Abu. She has her actual last name is longer than that, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I will butcher it. But she's a rapid response researcher for Media Matters, and she's excellent. Yeah, and I'm not going to come up with a different one, because I think this one is actually kind of appropriate. This one is, and I've been watching the HBO series The Last of Us, and I was pretty sure I was done with kind of apocalyptic zombie genres of television shows and movies, but this has really renewed my interest in it because it's so different and so unique and so beautifully filmed. I've never played the video game. It's based on a video game called The Last of Us, but I was already on board, with this show after the first 2 episodes. And this past Sunday, there was an episode which is one of the best episodes of television that I've seen in the last few years. It was essentially just this beautiful gay love story that played out on screen, set within kind of a zombie apocalypse, without any of the kind of gay tropes that you see portrayed a lot on television and film. And it was just magnificent, from the acting to the cinematography, to the story that was told. It was just so beautiful. I can't recommend the show more highly. It's just, it was one of the best hours I've spent in front of a television screen in a long time. It was just amazing.
That's good to know. And I'm really excited about it. I haven't watched yet because I made a promise with a friend of mine that we were going to watch them together. So hopefully that friend and I will be able to get together this weekend and maybe binge the first 3 episodes, because I'm doing all I can to avoid knowing anything about the show. And I love dystopian fiction. Here's the thing. I haven't even watched the last 3 episodes of the most recent season of the Handmaid's Tale, just because it became too much for me. You know, after the first scene in the Dragons spinoff from Game of Thrones, the first episode, there was like this forced birth scene and I couldn't take it anymore. Like, so I've just been relying on, you know, like pop TV and familiarity. So that is a great recommendation. And we're way over time, but thank you so much, Teddy. I really enjoyed this discussion today. I really enjoyed your Twitter space. I'm glad that you know, I've stumbled upon all the work that you do that's really important. And I just appreciate you so much for showing up to our webinar today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure. I was glad to be able to talk with you and have this discussion. I'm really glad that I chose not to have a PowerPoint or anything like that. I felt like this was much better, more engaging. But yeah, and if folks are interested, yeah, you can find me on any of the social media, same handle everywhere, Report by Wilson. The Twitter space that you mentioned, that was recorded. So if you go back, you can go back and listen to the entire Twitter space. And of course, you can find all of my work at my Radical Reports newsletter on Substack. It's radicalreports.substack.com. There's free and paid subscriptions available, either one, I don't care.
But you take the paid ones for sure. So yeah, let's just go ahead and say, give Teddy, if you enjoyed today, please subscribe to his Substack, because there's some really great information on there too. So thank you so much today. Thanks everybody. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and there is hope out there. And watch Last of Us.
Yeah.
Bye everybody. Have a great weekend. Take care.
Stay safe, y'all.
For sure.